Next, I would like to welcome Professor Nitin Sawhney on stage. So he's the Professor of Practice at the Department of Computer Sciences at Aalto-University. He's leading the, and now again I need to read the abbreviation, CRAI-CIS, which is the Critical AI and Crisis Interrogatives Research Group in the Department of Computer Sciences. And looking forward to your perspective on the topic.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to see all of you here in person. It's fantastic that we can have the Goethe-Institut host this event for us. And also great to go after Maxine and Tanya's really excellent insights. What I'd like to do is perhaps, if I can get to the slides, yes. I want to talk a bit about agency. Where does agency lie in our ecosystems? We can think of agency as individual agency, which is the ability for us to act on our own beliefs and our circumstances and how we shape them through our moral will. We can think of how we bring our compassion and ideologies to that agency. And obviously, many structural systems affect our agency. We only have the capacity to do certain things within the structure of society. Our gender, our class, our ethnicity might shape the kind of agency we have in a system. But there's also collective agency, because we have a social contract with each other of how we act here in this room. And we have a collective agency of how our behavior functions. And we can cooperatively shape that agency. But these agencies are actually informed by intentionality. They're informed by our power to do certain things and by our rationality often. But we also make irrational decisions. We also make decisions based on emotions. And that has to be reflected in the kind of agency we exhibit and the predictability of our agency. So what happens when we start building machines into our society? Where does the agency lie in that context? Is there a kind of proxy agency that these machines are acting on our behalf? Ultimately, the agency is with the humans, but the machines are simply performing some algorithmic calculations, and then ultimately we are responsible for whatever calculation it makes. And that's increasingly becoming challenging because we're building machines that are becoming more autonomous. They are starting to use a lot of large data sets and learn something and make predictions based on that, and we ourselves cannot explain why they made those decisions. So then who has the agency? It's a really fundamental philosophical question that we're always grappling with. So is there an illusion of agency that we think we have when machines are essentially performing a lot of actions on our behalf? Are we projecting our hopes, fears, and aspirations on these machines? And again, are we sometimes thinking critically about the responsibility we have in the actions we did or didn't cause in that illusionary framework of agency? So we need to think about this whole ecology of human and non-human systems to really bring ethics to bear, and this is a real challenge for us. So let me see if I can quickly play this piece. I wonder if it will play. Yeah.
We treat the river as a brother or a sister, a father or a mother. It has rights, as do you and I. The new status for the river, Te Awa Tupua, means that the river has a voice, and in doing so, the tribe now has a voice. Our river faces many challenges. Most of the land area has been cleared of its native forest. The headwaters of the river, which flows from its source, have been diverted for hydroelectricity generation, which has destroyed habitat for fish. When you're dealing with a sick river, you feel sick yourself, because that river is you and you are that river. The laws that were brought to this country totally ignored the river's rights to be heard. So our vision for the future is that all communities of this river will view the river in the same way as the indigenous peoples do. We are owned by the river. We do not own the river. The river owns us.
So this was a piece by National Geographic when they examined what was happening in New Zealand a few years ago in the Wakami River, where the indigenous communities actually lobbied very hard to give the river rights. They wanted to give the river agency so that it could demand that it be protected in certain ways from hydroelectric power, from development, and so on. There are many communities involved around the river, both indigenous communities as well as farmers, fishermen, herders, and they all have many forms of agency, but the river is integral to that agency. So as we think about critical frameworks of ethics, rights responsibilities are really important, and how do we distribute them across the entire ecology? This is one example of a way forward of how we think about this in a much more integrated fashion. So I have a lot of slides, but I'm going to try to leave you with a couple of important things that you should think about. We need to think about rights, risks, and responsibilities in any framework of larger ecological systems, whether that includes digital systems, AI systems, or not. And we have to think about how we do that through inclusion, participation, and genuine agency. So I teach a course around ethics of AI at Aalto quite regularly, and I often get practitioners from industry to come to that course, and we talk about basic ideas of ethics, from what it means in terms of moral obligations of humans, but we also talk about what it means in a very collective kind of ecosystem context. And there are many different areas of ethics: meta-ethics, normative ethics, applied ethics. Most of what we think about today is how we apply those ethical approaches and principles to fields of biology, political science, environment, and in our case, in computer science, how we apply them to machine ethics. This is a very kind of nice overview which shows you many different kinds of ethical theories that look at both your own individual agency through agent ethics and also action ethics of how you conduct your actions. And there are many factors there about emotivism, intuitism, virtue. But what matters at the end is how we think of situational ethics, how we act in a certain condition, and is that predictable, or is that something we have to determine in very different ways? What I like to draw on sometimes is science fiction, because Isaac Asimov in the 60s and 70s, when he wrote his science fiction books, he came up with initially 3 laws of robotics. And eventually he came up with the 0th law of robotics, where robots, or in his case AI systems, do not harm humanity by inaction or allow any kind of harm to come to humanity. So it was also a self-correcting measure. So we can look at arts, sciences, philosophy, humanities, and examine different ways that they think of ethical behavior and how they think of agency. So in my course, I often ask students to make sense of ethics on their own. What kind of concepts emerge when they think of ethics? What conflicts of interest emerge? Transparency. Here's another board where they were talking about justice, empathy, vengeance came up, accountability. It's really intriguing when you bring students together to actually unpack these concepts before they've actually had full training on these theoretical frameworks. And now, as Maxime was saying, we should think about the role of ethical frameworks in the context of artificial intelligence. I tend not to use the term AI very regularly. I tend to use the term algorithmic decision-making using big data, because that helps us kind of frame the problems in a much more interesting way and a much more realistic way. Because part of how what we think of as AI functions is through learning patterns of large data sets, whether it does it through certain methodologies like deep learning or more straightforward frameworks. And we'll talk a little bit about that. This is a very basic diagram of how machine learning typically works, with using a data set that it wants to train on, using supervised or unsupervised learning, extracting key features, classifying it, and coming up with a prediction model. And it does that over and over again as it gets better and better in making predictions. At least that's what we do in theory. And there are many different kinds of machine learning models that use supervised, unsupervised learning, and also reinforcement learning, as Maxime was saying. And they're used in many different kinds of very mundane tasks, from industrial process optimization to marketing systems, to actual gaming systems that have gotten much better than humans now in using reinforcement learning. But they all have multiple challenges and flaws that we will talk about. Deep learning has become, in the last 15, 20 years, a fairly powerful framework. What you're seeing here is a convolutional neural network that learns by multiple hidden layers. Every layer in the system, that's what deep means. It's how deep do you go in the system, for how many layers you use to do the training of the data. And every layer is training itself on a certain feature of the face, for example. The color, the shape, features of the eyes, and then it uses that data to then make predictions. And as it continues making predictions, it gets better. But again, these are limited problem domains within which they function, and we tend to think that they're solving some kind of magical thing, but they're actually using a very basic, straightforward algorithmic process. But through convolution and matrix operations, they're actually amplifying that. And we have no way to determine what's actually going on in these hidden layers. So explainability is a huge problem, and that's why we have to ask very hard questions at every stage, from the data to the training models. What is being done? How do we, as designers, programmers, developers of these systems, question that, and where do we bring our agency into the process? So in terms of bringing ethical AI, we have to recognize that there's really messy real-world data we're dealing with. It's not laboratory problems anymore, and they're prone to human error and misunderstanding. These models are incomplete and ambiguous, and there's insufficient evaluation and oversight of these models. And the quality of these outcomes obviously determine the ethical quality of its impact on humans. So there are many areas that we think of where we have to bring really a critical overview of this. There's bias and fairness, accountability, remediability, transparency, safety, and value alignment. I will talk very, very quickly through these because I tend to go through this in my courses in a much more in-depth way. We have many cognitive biases in human decision-making, and these are often incomplete, skewed, and lead to many forms of prejudice that we bring and flawed assumptions. And this leads to many kinds of unfair outcomes. So here's just from a basic psychology perspective, 50 kinds of cognitive biases. And each and every one of these is things that we deal with in our daily lives, and we have to think about what our positionality is when these biases affect our decision-making. There's a great project called Gender Shades by a colleague of mine at MIT, where she talks about these biases in face recognition. Let's see if we can quickly play this video.
Hi, I'm Joy, and I research how computers detect, recognize, and classify people's faces. In my TED featured talk, I spoke about my experience with the coded gaze, my term for algorithmic bias. The system I was using worked well on my lighter-skinned friend's face, but when it came to detecting my face, it didn't do so well, until I put on a white mask. After my talk was posted, I tested my speaker image profile across different facial analysis demos. 2 of the demos didn't detect my face. The other 2, well, they misgendered me. The demos didn't even distinguish between gender identity and biological sex. They just provided 2 labels, male and female. Now I wanted to see if these results were just because of my unique facial features, or if this was something that was more of a pattern across other faces too. So I began a project that became my MIT thesis, Gender Shades, or the long title, Gender Shades, Intersectional Phenotypic and Demographic Evaluation of Face Datasets and Gender Classifiers, or just Gender Shades. I wanted to see how well different gender classification systems worked across different people's faces, and if the results changed based on somebody's gender or their skin type. I created a dataset of over 1,000 images of parliament members ranked among the top 10 in the world based on their representation of women in power. To get at a range of skin types, I chose 3 African countries and 3 European countries, so I could see how the system performed on lighter skin and darker skin. Then I chose 3 companies to evaluate: IBM, Microsoft, and Face++, which has access to one of the largest data sets of Chinese faces. So now with the data set and the companies, I decided to run a test. The companies appear to have relatively high accuracy overall. Microsoft performed best, achieving 94% accuracy on the whole data set. All companies perform better on males than females, and all companies also perform better on lighter subjects than on darker subjects. When we analyzed the results by 4 subgroups, we saw that all companies performed worst on darker females. IBM and Microsoft performed best on lighter males, and Face++ performed best on darker males compared to the others. IBM had the largest gap in accuracy, with a difference of 34% in error rates between lighter males and darker females. I was surprised to see multiple commercial products failing on over 1 in 3 women of color. In fact, as we tested women with darker and darker skin, the chances of being correctly gendered came close to a coin toss. While more research is needed to explore the specific reasons for the accuracy differences, one general issue is the lack of diversity in training images and benchmark datasets. Failure to separate accuracy results across traits like gender and skin type also makes it harder to identify differences. Companies should do better with commercially sold products, especially since the machine learning techniques that have made gender classification possible are applied to other domains of computer vision, like facial recognition, and other areas of artificial intelligence, like predictive analytics. Predictive systems can help determine who is hired, granted a loan, or what information a particular individual sees. These data-centric technologies are vulnerable to bias and abuse. As a result, we must demand more transparency and more accountability. We have entered the age of automation overconfident yet underprepared. If we fail to make ethical and inclusive artificial intelligence, we risk losing gains made in civil rights and gender equity under the guise of machine neutrality. The coded gaze reflected in the Gender Shades project must be faced.
Okay, so Joy has been hugely influential in the US. She's spoken at Congress. She has lobbied very hard for companies to be much more critical about the use of facial recognition. In fact, the tax authority in the US was planning to use facial recognition, and they stepped back from that because of Joy's activism. There was a documentary about Joy's work called Coded Bias, and we actually brought the director to Helsinki to speak about it last year. And it's really important that we have these discussions. Here is a case of somebody who actually was profiled because he went into a store, and at some point, many months later, somebody had robbed a store, and they found his face in some database and used that to accuse him. And it was the first instance in the U.S. of an AI-based decision that was being made that actually falsely accused somebody, and they finally had to, remediate that. So these are real problems of accountability, remediability that Joy talked about, and we need to bring humans in the loop in terms of good governance and thinking about this. And many agencies, many human rights organizations have been pushing hard to bring that kind of transparency, explainability into these systems. So I'm going to go a little bit faster because I just want to wrap up in a few minutes, but safety and privacy are also very crucial aspects of this, and we have to think about that. GDPR is one mechanism that allows us to enforce that, but there are new mechanisms that are coming out, such as the AI Act, which I'll talk very briefly about, that are dealing with this. And value alignment is, I think, the last principle that came up in this, which is dealing with how we bring our values into these systems that align with the norms that we think are important, say in the context of Finland, which may be different from the context of Russia and China when they build systems there. And that alignment is really crucial to resolve conflicts that emerge and who has the power and agency to deal with those conflicts. So I usually do a case study-driven approach with my students where we examine cases right here in Finland, from everything from contact tracing to the use of chatbots for maternity care to more complex scenarios of surveillance and so on. And we we work through these case studies to think, what are the challenges, what are the biases, what are the mechanisms of accountability, and so on. Now, the EU has been working very hard on this issue for many years and thinking about many frameworks that deal with accountability, governance, transparency. And more recently, as many speakers will tell you, the AI Act has emerged, and there are real challenges with the AI Act in terms of adoption, in terms of understanding what is considered very high risk, how do you even define the notion of artificial intelligence, and it requires a lot more thinking about issues of compliance in this kind of context. So how do we move forward with here? There are many aspects to devising ethical AI principles in different institutions, ensuring oversight and governance, promoting diversity and inclusion, and democratizing AI through open education. And ultimately, how do you do participatory value-sensitive design? I won't walk through all of these, but many organizations, such as Futurist, OP Bank, are coming up with AI ethical principles on their own. And one I liked was the kind of human rights perspective that, for example, Futurist was bringing in terms of environmental harms as well, and harms in the whole ecology of the system. Oversight is super crucial. Many companies have so-called advisory boards. Facebook has one that it barely actually listens to. Google has one that it basically fired. So unless we bring real actionable oversight, we cannot hold these companies accountable. And inclusion and diversity is something that we talk about, we give lip service to, but it's actually really crucial in terms of ensuring that we bring a real kind of agency into the system. And then that is part of the process of democratizing AI. And this is Teemu Rosa's initiative here at Helsinki University that has helped at least many people in Finland get on board, but all across the world who are using this kind of coursework. We have to do more of that in terms of training people, everyday citizens, to reconcile these kind of general ideas and understand how they can participate in that. And part of what we're doing at Aalto is also doing participatory action research, value-sensitive design in the projects we undertake. So I ran a course last year on critical AI and data justice, where we talked about everything from how we think of the entire ecology of an AI system. For example, an Amazon Echo device is manufactured in multiple places using minerals from many different sources, using data that is trained in China and India. It's a huge ecology, and the values and agency in that system are very complex to understand. And what I love is learning from indigenous perspectives. That's why I brought up the initial slide, looking at what was done in New Zealand. This is a colleague of ours, Jason, who is in Concordia University in Montreal, who has an indigenous background and has worked with many indigenous communities to think about this. And they have a whole framework, a white paper they wrote recently, that looks about relationality, reciprocity, governance using indigenous protocols, bringing cultural norms and ethical design and sovereignty to data rights. So this is a really interesting framework that we should be thinking outside the box of the Western framework. How do we look at Global South and indigenous communities as a source of knowledge to understand this? So kind of wrapping up, what are we doing at Aalto? Most recently, we got a large 4-year grant from the Kone Foundation to examine issues of civic agency and AI, particularly in the public sector. And the way we're going about it is we're understanding values, norms, and positions that the public sector is taking in this. What are the ways to think of risk, rights, and responsibilities? And how can we design algorithmic literacy and participatory design processes to make these things more accountable? Mary actually is advising us on this project, and she'll be speaking to you next. And there are many different components of the research we're doing. I'm just going to highlight 3 components very quickly. One is looking at language, the discourses that are embedded in how we talk about AI. And we actually have linguists working on this project, analyzing data from newspapers, from government reports, from the AI Act, and people's comments on that, and doing that kind of building a language corpus of that data, and understanding the discourses and how they shape our perceptions. We have another team working on actual case studies of AI services using design research and participatory action research, involving citizens in the process in designing these services in the future. And we have a team of legal scholars and policymakers working with us, looking at these things from a different perspective as well. So I'll just close with this. Again, for me, thinking about civic agency and AI is a very crucial way of framing this, and rights, risks, and responsibilities are an important component of that, and how we do that through inclusion, participation, agency is what I'd like us to think about throughout the day. Thank you.
Thank you.